I am the son of a depressed father who was the son of a depressed father. And I like to say that my children will not say that.
The way I was raised, number one, if you're having a tough day, emotionally, get over it. Nobody wants to hear your mess.
I looked at my job, I looked at my relationship with my wife, I looked at my relationship with my family, I looked at everything. I just tore everything apart trying to find what was wrong with any of this. Why am I feeling like there's nothing valuable anymore?
I had moments during that first depression when I felt like everybody would be better off if I was dead. Everybody, including my children. It wasn't so much that I didn't care about them or care what they thought. I thought everybody will be better off if I just disappear.
Depression is really a pretty widespread phenomenon. In fact, the World Health Organization of the United Nations completed a study just a couple of years ago called the Global Burden of Disease Study. And this study found that depression is the fourth leading cause of disability in the world.
I don't like to use the word illness or disease because that just sort of reinforces the biomedical view, which I don't believe in. So I'm going to avoid it. And I talk about emotional problems, psychological problems, severe emotional crises, all the kind of things that are words that are not medicalizing, but rather to describe states of distress, which, of course, we have.
People who use ordinary language in generic, non-professional ways are very liable to be influenced heavily by what they're bombarded with via many kinds of media. So as the word depression is being used usually these days to denote a very serious kind of clinical condition, it's become an umbrella term that captures almost every human mood, from merely disappointment and unhappiness at one end of the spectrum all the way up, I suppose, to very serious kinds of clinical depressions.
Well, depression is a problematic term because it means so many things. But in psychiatry, it refers to a whole syndrome that involves physical symptoms like a decrease in energy, difficulty sleeping, and poor appetite. It includes psychological symptoms like feelings of guilt and hopelessness. And it includes changes in mood like sadness, irritability, anxiety, and so forth. Dysthymia involves fewer symptoms and of lesser severity. So it's sort of a chronic, mild, low-level depression.
People with dysthymia often have a sense of pessimism or hopelessness about things. They often feel that they are a failure. They have a very strong sense of personal failure. Unlike depression, which is often experienced as a real change from one's usual level of function and level of being, dysthymia begins to feel like it's part of your personality.
In some ways, when someone says they're depressed, what they're saying is, I'm feeling hopeless and helpless. So it's a debilitating disease in the sense that you don't reach out for help because you feel like the help isn't going to help. That's part of what being depressed feels like. And there's a way in which, when it's really got you by the throat like that, you almost have to think your way through it. You won't feel like doing anything is going to help.
Depression is not a disease. That's the starting problem. Depression is a psychological, spiritual disorder. That is, it's not really a physical disorder in any sense of the word. People get depressed for reasons. They have losses, they have disappointments, they have conflicts they can't resolve, They want more out of life, don't know how to get it. They've lost a loved one, feel guilty, feel shame. It's about life. Depression is about coming to grips with life.
It's no secret that there are no known specific causes, etiologies in the professional terms, of any of the major mental illnesses. There are no laboratory tests, no agents you can identify, no cellular lesions. And so when I say to somebody, well, I think you're depressed, there's no way I can say, now I want you to go across the street to the lab and have the depression blood test and we'll be sure you're depressed. So what psychiatry is left with is opinion and perceptions of the other. And so it's me, as this person called a psychiatrist, looking at you, this person called a patient, and saying what I think is wrong with you.
I'm sure you've heard people say, I would be willing to cut off a leg if it meant I wouldn't be depressed anymore. God forgive me for saying such a thing.
The more severe syndromes where people really become quite withdrawn and start losing weight and are not sleeping and start having guilty ruminations and even become psychotic, these are syndromes that really need to get treated with medication, or in some cases electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. That's another treatment that's highly effective for severe depression. We would never use it for dysthymia, for example, though.
Another way to look at this is how bad it is to have a pill as your last resort. So let's say we're talking and you're really feeling really suicidal. So you say, Peter, you know, I could kill myself tonight. And that person looks at me and thinks I have nothing more to say other than we'll increase your Prozac, we'll give you Paxil, we'll send you to a mental hospital where we can really drug you up. That is going to increase desperation.
In terms of the gold standard of treatment for depression, everything is measured against ECT for severe depression. So one wouldn't consider a patient to have undergone definitive treatment for depression until they'd undergone ECT. Just as with the antidepressant medications, we're not exactly sure how it works. It's given nowadays in much the same way as you'd undergo any kind of same-day surgery procedure where you might go to the ECT suite and you receive an anesthetic agent from an anesthesiologist and you're put to sleep briefly, and then the psychiatrist administers a brief electrical stimulus, and you have muscle relaxants on board, so what an observer might see is your toes might twitch or your hands might clench a little bit, and then a few minutes after that you wake up and then you spend a bit of time, maybe a couple hours in a recovery room, and then you go home. And you have that treatment anywhere from maybe 6 to 12 times until you're feeling better. So it's a very benign procedure and really quite safe.
Electroshock treatment is closed-head electrical injury. We put electrodes on the brain, pass roughly the equivalent of house current through the brain, cause searing, heat damage, contraction of blood vessels, anoxia of the brain, that is loss of oxygen because the vessels clamp down from the tiniest little bit of electricity, let alone what we put through. It's enough to cause a major convulsion. The convulsion is not like your ordinary epileptic seizure. It is so severe that patients used to break their spines and their limbs when they were being held. So the docs came up with, we'll paralyze the patients, call it muscle relaxation, and knock them out, so then they won't break their spines and their limbs.
The main side effects from ECT are memory problems, and that can be minimized to some extent by the way that the ECT is delivered, for example, delivering ECT to one side of the brain as opposed to both sides can decrease the memory effects. But I'd say that's the major difficulty with ECT, is that it can affect particularly what we call anterograde or short-term memory. So typically people who have the memory problem will have difficulty remembering the circumstances around the time when they had the ECT. And often they won't remember much of that at all, even though at the time they'll seem like they are processing everything. But then maybe 6 months later they won't have a good recollection for what happened during that several-week period. Less commonly, people can have longer-term memory deficits, which are a side effect, but on balance, when someone has a good response to ECT, usually they will say that, gee, the memory loss was a problem for me, but not as much a problem as how depressed I was.
It's terribly destructive to memory. I have in depth evaluated patients who've had whole careers wiped out, nurses who lost their nursing education, lawyers who couldn't practice anymore, including people with brain damage on brain scan. And you've got to have a lot of damage for it to show up on brain scan. Damage on neuropsychological testing. Not to mention just the patient's feelings that their brains aren't working well anymore.
Even though antidepressants have been available to us since the mid-1950s, we don't know exactly how they work. We know some of the ways in which they work. Estimated 10 billion neurons in the brain. They are not connected, anatomically. The neurons go up and there is a small separation between the neurons. And for one neuron to communicate with the next, it secretes a chemical neurotransmitter, which diffuses across the synapse, or the cleft between the two neurons, and then is taken up by the receptors on the second neuron, which then starts another neural impulse. Everything we can tell about depression is that there is a deficit in neurotransmitter at the synapse in people with depression. So all the medications we know about at least have an effect at increasing the concentration of the neurotransmitter at the synapse, or acting on specific receptor systems in the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron. We know these things occur. We do know that that is one of the ways in which they work, but we don't know exactly all of the mechanisms by which they work. But it's a very good model to use in terms of explaining it to someone. You're putting them on medication, that you have a biochemical deficit in the brain, an abnormality that we are going to correct with this medication and with this psychotherapy, which will also help.
Oh, we hear about biochemical imbalances. Everybody's got a biochemical imbalance. Do you know the only biochemical imbalance we know about in the brains of people called mental patients are the ones we put in? Every patient who goes to a psychiatrist nowadays walks out with a biochemical imbalance. They've been given a drug or a prescription for a drug. Do you know how the drug companies test a drug? First, they find out if it creates a biochemical imbalance in the brain of a rat. So if you're screening for a new drug like Prozac or Paxil, you give thousands of rats, thousands or hundreds at least of alternative chemicals, and you grind up their brains, and then you find one that, quote, works. That is, it's disrupting the brain's function. They see it in a rat and they say, we'll give it to people and we'll claim it's correcting a biochemical imbalance. That'll be our PR campaign. Now, of course, there's no test for that in people. We can't grind up their brains. We can't test the people who come in the office, see if they have biochemical imbalance. Besides, all the rats we tried it on, they had normal brains, so it wouldn't make any difference whether the patients had abnormal brains or not. In other words, it's a scam. Biochemical imbalance is a scam.
There are three major monoamines: norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. All these medications have an impact on one or more of these three monoamine neurotransmitters. Originally, the antidepressants worked on all three neurotransmitters, but they also brought a lot of side effects with it. Then medications began to be developed which work on one or more specific neurotransmitters, on norepinephrine alone, which has to do with activation, or on serotonin, which has to do with appetite and probably sleep as well, or on dopamine, which regulates the reward system. If you talk about the symptom of depression, loss of interest and pleasure in most things. Well, you know that has probably something to do with the dopamine system. You know, loss of appetite, weight loss, probably serotonin, lack of energy, lethargy, psychological inertia in getting things going, probably norepinephrine, so that in very, very generic ways that have not necessarily been proven, but something we know about the neurotransmitters, you can take a guess as to what's going on.
We haven't the faintest idea how the brain works. Every human brain by itself is more complicated than the physical universe. Several 100 million neurons. And some of these cells having 10,000 connections to other cells. We're looking at a system that is so complex we can't begin to understand it. When your doctor tells you you have an imbalance in serotonin, you've got not the faintest idea what you're talking about. The serotonin nerves go throughout the brain. That is, nerves that are stimulated by serotonin. They go into the frontal lobes. That's where you think and feel and judge and love and hate. They go into the temporal lobe. That's where you have memory centers and emotional centers. They go back to the cerebellum, where balance and coordination. And they go down the spinal cord. You've got serotonin also active in the gut, in the blood. And beyond that, these serotonin nerves may be activated by a dozen or more other kinds of neurochemicals. We talk about like 6 neurotransmitters or so. Norepinephrine, serotonin, acetylcholine, dopamine. Why those? Because those are the ones that psychiatric drugs affect, so the drug companies spend a lot of money on them. And they talk about them. They don't tell you, you've probably got 200 more neurotransmitters, most of which we haven't even identified. And the neurotransmitters are but a tiny part of a huge system that's electrical in nature, hormonal in nature. Come on. I'm sad because I have a biochemical imbalance in my serotonin. It's absolutely ridiculous. Only billions of dollars could keep that kind of nonsense afloat. One of the great frustrations to me has been how the media swallows every ridiculous thing that comes out of the pharmaceutical industry. All they have to do is do a press release, and the New York Times prints it practically verbatim as the latest news. Now, why is that? For one, there's billions of dollars. When I first started taking on Prozac, I was the expert for all the combined Prozac suits back in 1994, 160 suits, and I was the one investigating the science of it all. At that point in time, Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Prozac, was earning over $2 billion a year on the drug, and their corporate revenues were only $4 million. It was more than half of their corporate revenue. Well, they spend a lot of that billions on influencing the media, influencing doctors who give lectures, influencing doctors to write papers, ghost-writing papers, producing studies that don't work and publishing them as if they do work, and on and on and on. And the gullible media, wined and dined by these guys, believes them. So pretty much anything you get in the media is going to be nonsense. I'll give you a horrendously wonderful example. At Johns Hopkins, they did research on methamphetamine. Everybody knows that's terrible for you. And they found out that it causes abnormalities in the brains of people who take it. So they published these press releases saying that methamphetamine causes abnormalities in the brains of human beings. And they're glad to do it. Why? Because there's no corporate sponsor for methamphetamine. Now, same place, Johns Hopkins. They come up with a study that Prozac causes abnormal growth of cells in the temporal lobes of the brain. What does that sound like? That sounds like pre-tumor. Certainly is abnormal. I mean, the average human being would not want to go to their doctor and hear, would you like to have a few abnormal cells in your temporal lobe? Prozac will do it. What do? They publish a press release from Hopkins saying, why, mechanism of action, of helpfulness, discovered for Prozac. It increases the growth of brain cells. No exaggeration. And it's not just the publicists at Johns Hopkins, it's the researchers going along with this. That's the level of nonsense we're at. That something we see that would cause damage in a brain and that we would be deeply upset about if it was from alcohol or tobacco or methamphetamine, we claim is an improvement when it comes from big pharma and is given to mental patients.
Now you have to remember, a lot of people are being given those drugs. I mean, they're handed out like candy. And they're handed out mostly by non-psychiatrists, 60-odd%, because the pharmaceutical industry has convinced doctors in general that the SSRIs in particular are safe, effective, and well tolerated. That's the mantra that the docs hear from the sales reps who come to their offices all the time. The industry spends $8 billion a year with those kinds of visits to docs. And they give them an equivalent amount in free samples. It's about a $50 billion a year industry to go to doctors' offices, talk to docs, and leave them samples.
Freud wrote rhapsodic papers, scientific papers that read like poetry about the blessings of cocaine. And of course, it turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. The history of psychiatry in this regard is endless. When the benzodiazepine tranquilizers were discovered, starting with a couple of drugs and then Valium, they became mother's little helper. Women all over the country were staying at home in the 50s and taking Valium, and it wasn't supposed to be addictive, and it turned out to be horrendously addictive.
Since the 1950s, when the first antidepressants were discovered, there has been a great deal of work to develop new medications, to develop different kinds, more specific, less side effects, more effective medications. And so currently we have over 25 antidepressants that are available now to treat people with depressive disorders.
The space between the neurons is a soup full of all these neurochemicals being put out by various nerves coming together and other nerves picking up the chemicals. We don't know much about how it works. What happens if you take Prozac? Each cell has a way of controlling the amount of neurotransmitter that it puts out. One way is to withdraw the neurotransmitter when there's too much of it. Pull it back into the cell. Think of it as a conveyor belt picking up rocks out of a mine and bringing them up, but it's chemical. Prozac jumps on the conveyor belt. It connects to the chemicals system that pulls the serotonin out. It gets in the way. So the serotonin can't jump on because the Prozac rocks are on, clogging up the conveyor. That results, at least temporarily or instantaneously, in an increasing puddling of serotonin in that wet space between the cells, where many other things are also puddling. But the brain doesn't like that. It says this is a very bad thing. It has at least 3 ways of trying to overcome that. First, it strengthens the conveyor belt. It says, you're blocking my conveyor belt, Prozac. I can't pull enough serotonin out. I'm going to pull more out. Another thing it does is it shuts down the production of serotonin. But the third thing it does, and these are just things we know, after a couple of decades of studying. The third thing it does is that the receptors that are catching the serotonin, when they sense there's too much coming at them, they die, they go away, they disappear, and they don't always come back. We have longer-term animal studies where they go looking for the receptors after you've been on Prozac or Paxil for a while, the animal, and the receptors are permanently, at least as long-term as can be studied, diminished, depleted. That's why people have such a horrible time coming off the drugs. You see, once your brain is compensated, what happens if you stop the drug? You go into withdrawal. And these drugs produce horrible withdrawals.
I have a tendency to build a tolerance to meds, so they'll put me on meds for a while and then I have to go off of them for a longer while, and so we kind of like go back and forth. And then finally this doctor looked at the various meds that work for short-term periods throughout my history and decided to try me on a combination of 3 of those meds. There were times that just the symptoms had gotten so bad with the medications that I was taking, because I had a lot of adverse reactions to them, that I got really psychotic. They kept trying different types of things and different combinations, and unfortunately I got on a combination of meds that my body just did not like at all. It totally exacerbated many of the symptoms that I had. I was feeling a lot more suicidal, but I had to fix the world before I could leave it. That was what was going on in my mind. I questioned doctors and stuff, and they reassured me it was just a result of the medication.
In the people who become suicidal or homicidal is 2 things. They get a case of what is called in the trade akathisia, which just means intense motor and emotional turmoil. When you hear people talk about it, they say, I just feel terrible. I can't stop moving. I can't stop doing anything. I'll do anything to get relief from this. I'll do anything at all. And these are people who are usually pacing. They can't stop moving their legs. They are in a severe mental and emotional turmoil, and a motor turmoil too. So that's one half of it. Along with that, the drugs have an effect that creates an attitude of, so what? Who cares? Now that may be their therapeutic effect, you see, but if you combine that attitude, which is basically you lose your sense of conscience, what's right and wrong, what should I do and what shouldn't I do, with this akathisia, if you combine those 2 things, then you get somebody who's crazed and has lost their judgment about what they should or shouldn't do. And so they may well do something that is not in their character at all, as basically an attempt to get relief.
What do the drugs do? The truth is, scientifically, they don't help. We know it now. The way a drug gets approved by the FDA is it has to have 2 studies that are more or less indicative of some positive outcome. These studies are 4 weeks long in the case of Prozac. And what do? They have little checklists like eating better, sleeping better. There's nothing on these checklists about having a wonderful life. There's nothing about even recovering from depression. You don't have to recover to get the improvements that they're trying to measure. They're very subjective. The doctor's just checking off a few items. But when you look at all the studies that are done, for example, for the approval of Prozac, not just the 2 the company picked out, you look at all. Prozac's no better than a sugar pill and a lot more dangerous. That's the sad truth.
First off, the evidence is out there that there are several kinds of psychotherapy that have shown to be effective with people with depression. They are as effective in relieving symptoms as medicines, and these were the older medicines, which are better than the newer ones. And there are fewer relapses with people who get talking therapy. for some people, the medications, whether it's from the placebo effect or the actual pharmacological effect, they feel better. The current crop of antidepressant drugs, the so-called SSRIs, which is like Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, that group of drugs, has really been way oversold in terms of their effectiveness and safety.
Drugs spellbind people. They convince people they're doing better when they're doing worse. When you take a drug, it dulls your spirits or it gives you an artificial high. That's about all the antidepressants can do. So you get a little elated for a while, but that's fake. That's biochemical. That's got nothing to do with life. Or you get anesthetized. You get apathetic. You don't feel your pain as much. For example, many people take antidepressants and they lose their sexual function, but they don't care. What does that mean? They've been anesthetized spiritually. You end up locked into place where you were before because your creative energies, your choices, they're not there anymore. And on top of it, because your neurotransmitters have been disrupted, you can't quite think with the same sharpness and the same feeling that you used to have. See, there's no magic in the fact that a doctor has touched a drug or a drug company has made it. That process doesn't mean it's wonderful. It's still a drug. And the fundamental question for people is, are drugs really the solution to life problems? And in regard to depression, it's a clear-cut answer. No, depression is a psychological, spiritual phenomenon. Drugs are not the answer. Just say no to drugs. But if you're on the drugs, it's really important that you taper off slowly, and if you can find it, get some really good clinical supervision and be sure to tell friends and family, because the drugs will spellbind you. They'll confuse you. You'll be coming off of them, and all of a sudden you'll get depressed and you won't even remember you were coming off a drug. You think you just got depressed. Or you'll get enraged and you'll forget that you were withdrawn from a drug. You'll just get enraged. So you need other folks to tell you, hey, remember you're coming off the drug. That's why you're upset.
Our body has the ability to make the serotonin if, in fact, that is really the cause, if we give it the right basic nutrients. The way serotonin is made in the body is it takes the raw materials of something called 5-HTP, which is a byproduct of tryptophan, and vitamin B6, and iron, and magnesium, and it makes serotonin. So if you don't have those basic ingredients, you can't make more serotonin. But if we give people these natural things, then their body can make more serotonin on its own. Pharmaceutical companies are very good at marketing. In fact, they're probably the best. And they know that all of this marketing they do on television, radio, newspaper, magazines is extremely effective. You know, ask your doctor if this drug is right for you. The public needs to recognize that they are not educating you, they are marketing to you. Just as doctors need to recognize that when they are being visited by a drug rep or being lectured to at a medical meeting by another doctor, that usually there's a pharmaceutical company behind that. True medical conditions have objective medical ways of diagnosing them. I hear this analogy often for depression, and I also hear it with ADHD when people don't want to take the drugs that are recommended for ADHD or depression. And the doctor has been taught to say, well, what are you doing? You know, if you had diabetes, you'd take insulin, wouldn't you? To convince them to take these drugs. Well, the problem I have with that is diabetes is a real medical condition. It is objectively defined. You draw the person's blood. If the blood sugar is too high and you do it twice, fasting, they have diabetes. And insulin is a chemical in our body that our body makes and that it must have for life. Depression or ADHD, either one, are subjectively defined by a list of symptoms, And the drugs used to treat those things are not found in the human body. So that's not a very good analogy, and I don't like that analogy at all, because it's, to me, very giving out a lot of misinformation, and really, I think, kind of tricking people into thinking that these psychiatric disorders are real medical conditions.
If I had to pick, 1,000 of the more curious books, then the DSM would rank very highly on that list. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which in effect is the Bible of diagnostic mental health industries. It's used by psychiatrists, it's produced by the APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association, and it's used also by clinical psychologists and others who have, by state licensure, some diagnostic privileges in terms of identifying problems with patients. There are a couple of things that are very curious about it. One is that diseases, mental illnesses, are elected to this book. If you look at the history of science, you will discover that every great breakthrough in science is not made by democratic means. It's made by individuals who are farsighted, who are intuitive, who are innovative in some way. They see something, they spot something that no one else has spotted, never by democratic methods. In the 1980s, the DSM had being gay as a kind of a mental illness. And then, of course, the power of the gay lobby increased to the point where they had to remove it.
Caffeine-induced anxiety is listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a psychiatric disorder. If you drink caffeine and you drink too much of it, it makes you shaky and feel anxious and releases that adrenaline that makes you feel anxious. It is a normal physiologic response of drinking too much caffeine. It's not a psychiatric disorder.
Now they've elected, early on in the 80s, they elected ADD, attention deficit disorder, which has become ADHD. This is a really big mental illness, which results in, 10 to 15 million children being drugged forcibly with Ritalin. And in fact, this is another problem of the culture and not at all a problem of brain disease in most cases. We've always had autism, we've always had a few disordered people with us, but never a so-called epidemic of this. If you do the epidemiology, you'll discover it's a problem of culture and not a problem of mental illness or brain disease.
Addiction to amphetamines is listed as a psychiatric disorder, and yet the treatment for many psychiatric disorders is amphetamines. It's kind of this circle of things that you can't find the beginning of and you can't find the end of, and everything ends up being a psychiatric disorder.
One of the more curious features and rather amusing features, I think, is if you disagree with the diagnosis of a psychiatrist, you're liable to be slapped with non-compliance with treatment disorder. So if you disagree with what I say, this is another illness. It's like having the book thrown at you. You're resisting arrest, so we can slap that charge on you too. One of the things that really amuses me about the DSM-4, which I have read cover to cover, is the introduction, which warns that an untrained person ought not to be reading this book. Reminds me very much of the Bible before Luther came around, when only priests could interpret the Bible. It wasn't up to you or I to have a stake in what message God, if God exists, might have for us. You had to have a priest acting as the intermediary between yourself and the divine power. You and I could not read that book because of the danger of us making our own interpretations of it. And similarly with the DSM, you're not supposed to read this book unless you're one of the priesthood, which knows which interpretation to make. It's a very curious book, is it not?
It's certainly true that there are some medical conditions that can result in symptoms that look like dysthymia or depression. For example, certain kinds of endocrine disorders like thyroid disease or hypercortisolism from excess adrenal gland function, certain kinds of anemias or blood disorders where the person loses energy or becomes sluggish, certain kinds of infectious illnesses, such as AIDS, for example. All of these illnesses can mimic depression or dysthymia. But they're usually fairly easily diagnosed with appropriate laboratory tests and physical and medical examination.
The number one thing I've found that makes people feel depressed is a low thyroid, hypothyroidism. Hormones and hormone imbalances is just another huge underlying cause of feeling depressed, not of depression. And again, to me it's a misnomer to use a psychiatric label on someone that has a physical problem. And postpartum depression to me just epitomizes what's completely wrong with using the depression diagnosis. I've heard doctors say, well, postpartum depression is real because women's hormones change after they give birth. Well, yes, that's true. But again, they don't have depression, they have a hormone imbalance. It should be postpartum hormone imbalance, and somebody should take the time to treat that hormone imbalance, fix it, level out those hormones, not put them on an antidepressant. They say the first symptom of scurvy is actually feeling depressed. So vitamin C deficiency can make you feel depressed. Magnesium is another that is well published in the medical literature. Vitamin B12, anemia. Any basic lab can do a test for a blood count and iron and see if that's there. In my practice, we use a specialty lab to look at other kinds of nutritional deficiencies. And there's special tests to do for testing for magnesium deficiency as well. Our neurotransmitters are changing in our body constantly. If you smile all day, certain neurotransmitters are going to be released. If you frown all day, certain neurotransmitters are going to be released. If you have allergies, histamine is released, and histamine is a neurotransmitter, which is why allergies is another underlying cause of depression, of feeling depressed, and ADHD symptoms for that matter, because the allergy cells in our body that cause the runny nose or the asthma or the skin reaction are also in our brain. They're everywhere in our body. So when that histamine cell, that mast cell, breaks open in the nose, you get swelling and runny nose. If it breaks open in the lungs, you get swelling and asthma. When it breaks open on the skin, you get a skin rash. But when it breaks open in the brain, you can have many different symptoms. You can have the so-called ADHD symptoms. You can feel depressed. You can feel fatigued. It can cause almost any symptom at all because it is a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter means it's a nervous system messenger. It's sending a nervous system message just by virtue of being there. And so it can override what you're trying to do. And we see this a lot with the kids who have been labeled ADHD, and we videotape them while we're doing the allergy testing, and they can be perfectly calm. And we give them the shot of something that they're allergic to, and they can just go ballistic or not be able to focus. You know, you can't see depression, and so the person who's getting skin tested has to tell us how they feel. That, yes, you just gave me a little injection of milk, and boy, I feel down. So if they cut that food out of their diet, or if we treat it, then that symptom goes away.
There's a lot of work going on with brain scans and neurotransmitters and all that kind of stuff. Lots and lots of work. And we've learned a lot about what the brain looks like, how it metabolizes oxygen under various states of consciousness, and we've learned about what substances do to neurotransmitters and a lot of stuff. But we've not found a single cause for any of the major mental illnesses. Now, if you look, however, on the social side of things, there are a whole lot of things that are, if not causal, at least highly associated with the development of problems, emotional distress. You take things like family communication patterns. Families that don't make sense have been shown that very often their kids don't make sense. That's what most people call schizophrenia. When families are very critical and hostile toward their kids, they grow up to often be rather critical and hostile toward themselves. And that is what generally gets labeled depression.
I had two very beautiful sons who were very supportive and loving, even though, you know, they were small, they were still very supportive. And they were going through so many beautiful things, and I really wasn't enjoying those things. And that was one of the things that I really hated about myself, you know? So how can you not sit there and find joy when this cute little 6-year-old comes up and says, Mommy, you know, look what I did. And then I started thinking my mother was like that all her life. I never heard my mother say, I love you, until my first son was 2 years old, and he wouldn't let her go until she said it. Because he kept going, Meme, I love you. And she'd say, good, I know, honey. Meme, I love you. I know, sweetie. But what are you supposed to tell me? And he wouldn't let her, you know, off the hook. And then finally she said it, and it was like somebody hit me upside the head. You know, wow, it's the first time in, you know, 25 years I've ever heard my mother say that to anybody. And I was afraid I was that way too. And when I looked at my son, I didn't want to be that way.
I talk about depression often as going through a family, generation to generation to generation, until one man in one generation turns around and does the work of facing the disorder and dealing with it. A lot of men who have depression unfortunately inflict their misery on the people around them by being irresponsible or unavailable or abusive. And this is the way in which the wound gets passed along from father to son to father to son to father to son, until one man turns around and faces the demons and deals with them and wrestles them to the ground and takes good care of himself.
I know a family who says, oh, we all have depression, it's genetic. My great-grandmother was depressed, my grandmother was depressed, my mother was depressed, and I have depression. It's genetic. And the DSM talks about that, and it says if your mother had it or your grandmother had it, then you probably have it. Well, no, it's not genetic, and probably they all didn't have depression. What if they all had undiagnosed thyroid problems? What if they all had undiagnosed magnesium deficiency? Because if a mother's deficient in magnesium, when she carries her baby, that baby's going to be deficient in magnesium too. So you could have all these generations of people thinking they have depression when they really all had a medical problem that could have been corrected, and these subsequent generations may not have had to deal with it.
I think that depression and disorders of self-esteem are very closely linked. The depressed state is really a shame state. You feel worthless, you feel less than. I've often said if you could take a stethoscope and listen to the brain of a depressed person, the odds are what you would hear is one part of the person beating up another part of the person. Real healthy self-esteem is your capacity to cherish yourself in the face of your own imperfections as a human being. A lot of people don't have that capacity because they weren't cherished for who they were in their families growing up. And across the board, men have difficulty with this capacity because ever since you've been a little boy, you're taught that you have to earn your worth by being a competitive winner. That is not healthy self-esteem. So what happens to a lot of depressed men is if they feel like they're not performing up to snuff, and the bar is pretty high for a lot of guys, then they move into this shame state. Then they start to attack themselves, eat themselves up alive. I believe that men express depression oftentimes differently than women do.
Don't speak back to me like that.
You don't see the depression itself. And in fact, the men may not feel the depression that much. It will break through because none of the defenses work all the time. But what you do see is what I call the footprints of the depression. And I talk about an unholy triad in covert depression. Self-medication, which is relying on alcohol or drugs to bring you up to feeling okay about yourself. Radical withdrawal, which is a really severe withdrawal from your relationships, from your sort of work, from your place in the world, and acting out. And acting out could run the range from just increased irritability all the way up to domestic violence. And I'm not saying that every batterer or every alcoholic is depressed, but I am saying that a great many of them are. And what you need to do with men who are suffering in this way is you need to treat both levels of the disorder. You have to treat the acting out or the self-medication first, and then you go for the underlying depression. If you just do one or the other, you're going to miss the boat.
Why would I want to do all this work? Why would I want to engage in psychotherapy of any sort and start to think about things that are upsetting to me when I can just take a pill? Rarely does it happen that someone is just born with an imbalance that causes them to see the world in a depressing way. More likely what happens is a person's experience will influence how they see the world, and that will change the balance of the chemistry in the brain. If you see yourself as being fundamentally flawed in some way, or unworthy or damaged, the medicine is not going to change your thoughts. But we know that things that we do behaviorally change the way our brain looks in brain scans. We can have effects on the brain by the things that we do, and the things that we think, and the things that we feel emotionally. And those are all things that happen in psychotherapy.
Up until now, I've always been in a work situation, or I had my children or something, and that made me feel like not being medicated was hard on them, and that I couldn't function. Function was very important. But I'm retired now, and I would like to explore what the kernel is, and if I take the medicine, I'm not going to find that out. And I won't get there because I won't feel the feelings that I need to understand why I'm in pain.
After a long discussion with my wife, I agreed to go see a counselor. I went to a couple counselors, both with my wife and by myself, and I kind of felt like, I wasn't really getting out of it what I wanted. I didn't feel like I was getting any advice or being told any options. I was more or less just hearing them tell me what I just told them, which, in my opinion, I knew what I thought. What I needed to know was what am I going to do about it.
People have to really pay attention. With me, for example, I went through individual therapy with a guy that I had a lot of respect for, and I thought we were working together well, probably for the first 5 or 6 years of my illness. And I saw him 3 times a week for those 5 years. And it was actually going nowhere except causing me to dwell on a lot of past experiences that were causing me to be very depressed, very anxious, very traumatized over and over and over again. I finally got hooked up with a guy about 5 years ago. We looked at, why I was doing the same things over and over again that were causing problems. We started changing the attitudes and the medication and the, incorporating new skills, and, I've come back up.
I am very pro-medication, but on the other hand, you don't want to just have somebody throw pills at you. In mild cases, you can decide you're just going to do the talk therapy. In no case can you just do the medication. You have to talk about your life, you have to talk about your feelings, you have to talk about your childhood. And for many of the men that I treat, you have to learn about how to be connected to yourself and connected to other people.
It's really true that dialogue has some kind of therapeutic value for people. If you get up in the morning and talk to yourself in the mirror all day, like a parakeet, it doesn't really have any effect. Whereas if you talk to somebody else, it can really make a difference. That person could be a friend, that person could be a professional. But talking to somebody else often has an effect where talking to oneself doesn't. So dialogue is very powerful.
I was talking to one of my clients who was talking about what he wants to give up for Lent this year. And I asked him, why not try to give up, like, you know, self-criticalness or something, or being hard on yourself. And he said, whoa, that's a lot harder than candy. Because of the habit of the mind. Quite often, you know, we will have this kind of self-criticism where we talk to ourselves and about ourselves can be very, very critical. And, you know, it is possible to start to have a different perspective on that. And that's what good therapy does.
Life poses us a whole series of challenges, one right after another, every one of us, as a depressed person or not. And usually we can deal with most of those challenges because of our past experiences, because of the way we solve the problems that life deals us. That can be anything as simple of a problem as how to open a doorknob or how to handle a distressing feeling or thought. We develop habits. Our brains are very efficient at coming up with scripts for how things are done. And so we tend to learn, okay, if we're in a situation where we're in a room where there's other people around and there's the smell of food and we see a list of food items up on a sign up above us and we're hungry and all of those cues come together, we know that we need to step up and we need to tell the person what it is we want and we need to give them money and they will give us food. That script works because it worked before, because we learned it. And now we don't think about it. And it's a good thing, because if we had to think about every little automatic thing that we do, we'd never be able to get anything done. The problem is that sometimes the things that we learn how to do are a little off kilter. We learn, maybe by virtue of the way we were raised, that we're no good, that we aren't worthy of whatever it might be, praise or wealth or good fortune. And there could be a lot of different pathways to depression. That's just one example. Well, the amazing thing is that research shows us that those pathways, those connections of neurons in our brain are not fixed. They can actually change. We do have the ability to be flexible and to solve problems in different ways than we always have.
The idea of therapy is to begin to take a look at the cause and effect of the mind that has a habit of responding the same kind of a way to a situation. Exploration becomes the first part of that. The second part of that is to come to some sort of understanding about that cause and effect. And then the third step to me is taking different actions, different behaviors, trying different things out. And in trying different things out, we experience ourselves in different kinds of ways. And the way we view ourselves and the way we see ourselves and the way we know ourselves becomes different. And you know, how we feel about ourselves hopefully improves in that kind of a thing. There's more of a competence. There's the things that ordinarily used to baffle us become more clear. We become more confident in them, and this is the process of healing and growth.
What's typically been touted as sort of the gold standard for treatment is cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is really recognizing that the way that we feel emotionally is related to what we think. And that if we see a situation and we think of it in a certain way, it's likely to lead us to feel a certain way. The example I've used 1,000 times with patients is you're lying in bed in the middle of the night and you hear a crash in the other room. The first thought that maybe goes through your mind that you can recall is there's someone breaking into the house. Your body is aroused, your heart is pounding, you're sitting up in bed, you're shaking. It'll lead you to have a whole certain sequence of thoughts and a whole sequence of behaviors, and it will give you a certain emotional component as well. So you may feel afraid, or you may feel angry because your house has been invaded, or whatever all else. Okay? So if you back up and then you take the same scenario again, you hear a crash, you're startled awake, and you think, oh, the cat knocked over the dish that was sitting on the counter, and now I'm going to have to clean it up in the morning. So you had certain thoughts, your body starts to calm down and relax. You engage in certain behaviors, which are probably getting back down under the covers and putting your head back on the pillow. Two different sets of thoughts that led to two completely different sets of sensations in the body, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. All of those resulted just because of a particular thought that you had about that sound that happened in your environment. So the idea was, in terms of depression, if a person tends to see the world in a certain way, if they tend to see everything is sort of their fault or everything's going to turn out badly, and when anything happens, they will tend to see life through that sort of lens. And so the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy was to help people to scientifically look at the patient's thoughts and say, is that really true, or do I change this? And if I change that core, it'll change the way I think about things. And if I change the way I think about things, they might not lead me to be so depressed. What is actually the curative factor or the active ingredient is the fact that people learn by this process of hypothesis testing and looking carefully and objectively at the data, which is their thoughts and feelings, that thoughts are interchangeable. That just because a thought occurs to you doesn't make it real. That thoughts are not facts. The person has a different relationship with their thoughts. They now are not so identified with them that they believe every thought that comes into their head. They're actually able to notice, hey, look at, yeah, there's that thought. Yeah, I have that thought a lot. Do I have to have that thought? Not really. Can I test it out to see if it's accurate or not? Sure.
If life is meaningful, then it's a real key to fulfillment. All of this stuff, look outside, we have trees, birds, deer, we have atmosphere to breathe. We're embodied beings, with all kinds of things going on in our lives. This is an accident, and it depresses people who think it's an accident. It's not going anywhere, it is meaningless, it's purposeless. So how you view things has a lot to do with how you feel about things also. If you start to view life as meaningful and purposive, then once again it becomes meaningful and purposive. I am a great believer in the greatness of human beings, which is often not revealed to people or by people. Society rather focuses on the negatives. But people have greatness, and they have to be told this. And then they have to be encouraged to find their greatness. And this is a philosophical exploration. Philosophy was viewed as both a practice and also a set of ideas that was very conducive to leading a good life. Philosophy in the West as well as the East has a very long tradition of activism as well and of application to society. Every person on this planet who's thoughtful at some time or other in life is going to encounter a fundamental question about what's right or wrong. Generically, what is meaningful? What is purposive? How do I lead a life of value? Or at certain times, what kind of a decision do I make concerning a marriage or concerning a career change? There are all these kinds of questions. If you want to reflect on these questions, maybe you should talk to a philosopher. We're not going to give you the answers, but we can certainly open up some space with you, help you to create a reflective space so that you can find what Plato called your inner wisdom. We induce wisdom in our clients in the best cases. So that's a kind of understanding of philosophical practice. Philosophy begins with the assumption that people have free will. Most of us have free will. Begins with the assumption that, in fact, as Buddha said, as we think, so shall we become. So if you couple those two premises, this is very powerful and empowering, is it not? First of all, you do have some freedom. Not all the freedom in the world. I can't sprout wings and fly if I simply want to or will, but there are many things that I can will to do and do. And it makes a big difference. What you choose for yourself is what happens to you. People need to understand this. They have tremendous power over their own lives by making appropriate choices as opposed to inappropriate ones. Our thoughts really do have consequences. Our thoughts and our speech and our actions all have consequences.
I worked for Dennis Waitley, who wrote The Psychology of Winning. I used to facilitate video-based seminars for him, and I invited my parents to come to a self-esteem segment of that seminar, and they were just blown away by it. They said, oh, we could have done this differently, we could have done that differently, and they stayed up all night talking about it. But one of the things that came from that is that I always blamed them for things in my life, because I wasn't this way because they said this or they did this. And so what we did is the three of us sat down, and I wrote down all the things that I blamed them for and that they had said to me, and that's why I'm not what I am, okay? So we rewrote all that, and they cut a tape for me with positive affirmations from them to me, and I listened to that thing for 6 months, put it on a sleep tape where I'd fall asleep to it at night and wake up to it in the morning, And I did that for 6 months, and pretty soon all those stories about why I couldn't do anything or why I couldn't do this because mom said this or dad said that, that was all gone. It wasn't there anymore. So I completely reprogrammed that with their help.
Most people's limitations, in fact, are self-imposed. Most people's unhappiness and unfulfillment in life is because of false ideas they have about themselves. Plato understood this, and that's why part of his philosophy is to get us, through the help often of a philosophical midwife, as he called it, to bring into the light of day exactly those ideas which we have of ourselves, which are wrong, our self-conceptions, which others have imposed on us at times when we're vulnerable, make us fail in life. And we can change our self-conceptions, and therefore we can change our lives. And that's the goal of philosophy, without drugs, without diagnosis.
Without meditation is like this. I'll give you the example. You are working continually without sleep. What will happen? Can you tell me? It's not going to last that long. If somebody is without sleep, working and working, you work so hard during the day, the night you have a certain hour of sleep, next day you are fresh, you are focused, you are clear. Because there's overwhelming things going on in their mind. Since we have this desire, anger, and hatred, we become like a magnet. When you have a magnet, you go through the junk metal, and every metal you touch is going to stuck on you. Soon, you're not able to move. You will have thousands of pounds of metal in your mind. It's the same thing with every day. If you don't meditate, something rises about desire, anger, or hate. All these things soon, your mind cannot deal with it. The meditation is the way to clear. The meditation is universal. It's not like a Buddhist, it's not like Christian, it's not like thing. Everybody needs meditation. No? See, the people go to beach, people go to the desert, people go in the forest. Why they have to go? They're doing meditation without naming meditation. No? Because they go to the desert, relax and nothing here and just so peaceful. I can breathe. No? Because this is the same thing. This is the meditation. Whether you name it or not, your soul's really, yearning and asking you to do meditate.
But I think that the key to having a really outstanding life is just being your own best friend, getting and having that relationship with yourself so that you have that self-trust. And I've learned to really, really live my life that way now, and it's more or less you're living life on faith, basically.
Mindfulness comes out of Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and that sort of thing, but there's really nothing inherently Buddhist or Eastern about the idea of being present, present for whatever happens to be here in the moment. And you can find traces of mindfulness, maybe called by different names in any spiritual tradition or any cultural background in one form or another. Mindfulness is really about cultivating our awareness that what we have in the world is what we have right here in this moment.
There are so many ways out of depression. It's not just counseling. I really want to keep coming back to it. People get out of it through religion. They get out of it through finding love. I mean, I've seen people become less depressed because they move.
There have been studies recently suggesting that depression benefits from a regimen of regular exercise, which maybe shouldn't be that surprising, but it turns out that regular exercise really helps people with depression.
To appreciate nature, to value nature, and to reunite with nature. Animals, plants, trees, mountains, forests, rivers, it's all good. Connect to it, and you'll feel primally at one with things.
We're very much in the mode of wanting to fix whatever is wrong with us. And sometimes depression has a lot to do with struggling with the things that we see are wrong with us, and maybe even losing our perspective about how much is wrong with us.
The antidote to depression is to love life. It's as simple as that. The person who can love life can find it in themselves to have hope and try again and allow love for other people, for nature, for animals, for God.
We have all the tools we need to be able to cope with the world. We sometimes can't access them, and sometimes we feel like there is no way to get to those things that we need, or we think we've lost the ability to cope. And really what this is about is slowing down, tuning in, paying attention, and recognizing that we have whatever we need within us.